Rosen, and I want to welcome you back to another edition of the Metabolic Flexibility series. I am the Adrenal Fatigue Recovery Ninja, and we're talking to you about becoming metabolically flexible. That means being able to run your machinery, whether you are stressed out, whether you're having no food, whether you're having too much food, whether you need more energy, you need less energy, you need more sleep, less sleep. That's what we're talking about. And so far we've been talking about metabolic flexibility is the formula of stress over blood glucose. And we're spending a lot of time on blood glucose because stress, which we'll get into, has a bunch of things on the top. But blood glucose has one thing, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the role of insulin. And we're talking about how we always think of insulin as taking glucose out of the bloodstream. And that's true. But we forget about the fact that insulin is basically a regulator of blood glucose levels. And that doesn't just mean putting glucose into the bloodstream, taking glucose out of the bloodstream. That also means regulating how much glucose gets into the bloodstream. And I know you thought, well, doesn't make sense. That's what cortisol does, or that's what growth hormone does, or that's what adrenaline does, or that's what glucagon does. And that's what it does, but that's when insulin is working not properly or not working optimally, then those other things will come into play. So insulin is the regulator, and that's what we're talking about. Insulin balances what's being put into the blood and what's being taken out of the blood. And I want to expand that idea and summarize it because you're like, who's this crazy guy and what's he talking about? So let's talk about it then. So we got these numbers because these scientists, they prove this. And they did studies, they did isotope studies, and they said, okay, let's talk about RD. RD is glucose disposal. That's everything that gets put into the bloodstream. Okay, and then we have glucose utilization, and that is what gets utilized by the tissues. We say that gets utilized by the brain, it gets utilized by the fat cells, it gets utilized by your muscles. It gets utilized by your red blood cells, and it gets peed out. So that has to balance, and that's what insulin does. Whether we're fasting, whether we're exercising, whether you have high demand, you have low demand, insulin is doing that. That's what we're talking about. And what's really cool is they've done these studies, and they're saying, okay, let's call liver production of the glucose, liver production of getting glucose into the bloodstream, let's call that a value. And that's what insulin does. That's what it regulates. And we're going to say that RA, which is the utilization of glucose by the liver or putting out glucose into the bloodstream by the liver, does it in two main ways. Glucogenolysis, so it breaks down the stored glycogen. And when you're eating often, this is the main form of energy into the blood supply. But let's say you took a 24-hour fast and you depleted all of your glycogen stores, then you're going to be putting glucose into the bloodstream through gluconeogenesis. And that's a breakdown of other tissues. And I'm going to give you a little foreshadow is the muscles can't do that directly. So the muscles can't put in their own glucose to the bloodstream directly because it's something called glucose 6-phosphate. We'll get into that in a second. And you may be wondering, hey, how does the ninja know all of this? I know all of this because in my former life, I have a background in exercise physiology from one of the best schools in the world, McMaster University in Canada. Go Marauders. I have an exercise physiology background. So now when I was dealing with my own exhaustion, my own adrenal fatigue, my own anxiety, looking into genetic testing, and having a psychology degree background, I realized my physiology degree background really comes into play here. So I want to try to explain this to you. So ultimately, once the 24-hour depletion of glycogen has been emptied, then gluconeogenesis takes place. And that's where we start to utilize fuel from proteins, and we'll talk about that on the next video. But I just want you to get that straight because I wanted to summarize all of this because you're still a bit confused, and I get that, but stick with me, got lots of videos here. So basically, we're going to prove in the next video that RD, which is glucose disposal, everything that gets put into the bloodstream, whether it's through glucogenolysis or gluconeogenesis. We're going to say that that number is always working hard to equal the tissue's utilization of glucose and peeing out of glucose. And we're going to say that to the point that when someone is fasting, glucose is high. So let's say someone eats a lot of calories and eats a lot of glucose, eats a lot of sugar, and they always have a high glucose level. On the next video, we're going to show the reason why that's always high is not so much that the insulin isn't doing a good job of getting glucose out of the bloodstream. It's more of a problem of the liver is pumping more glucose into the bloodstream. And the resting metabolic rate exceeds the amount that the kidneys can utilize, so you're peeing out a lot of glucose, and that's when you become dehydrated, but you're also pumping in a lot of glucose to keep that a steady high state. So think about it, say, what's the point of this anyways? The point of this is because you're suffering with a fatigue issue, because you are taking a bunch of hormones and medications, because you are always exhausted and you've done all these 1,001 different tests, and you think that there may be a major problem, maybe there's a stealth infection. Maybe there's not, maybe you're just not doing the basics and you're not controlling your glucose. And that maybe is a high probability, and until you finally learn how to do it, which is my mission, you're not going to fix the problem. So that's why. Stay tuned and we'll tell you more about it on the next video. Thank you so much.